could use a little sun this morning. Good morning. I'm Carrie Potter, and this is Dying to Bloom, a unique show that focuses on exploring death care and burial options to help you make informed decisions. The program is brought to you by the Green Burial Fund. This fund is established through the Rockland Community Foundation, which is also at rocklandgives.org, with the mission of bringing a green conservation cemetery to the Rockland County area. To give a better understanding of what that means, I borrowed some information from the Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery, which is located in Florida. A natural or green burial is a burial practice that uses biodegradable containers and avoids embalming fluids and vaults. The land is not cleared. There are no headstones. A conservation burial goes a step further to commit burial fees to pay for land protection, restoration, and management. Not only does conservation burial help protect land, but the burial area is restored to its natural condition and protected forever with a conservation easement. Native plants beautify the burial sites. Citizens who support conservation are offered a more meaningful burial option with the certainty that protected land is the ultimate legacy to leave for future generations. Families and friends are brought closer to nature in the commemoration of their loved one's death. So please consider making a donation in any amount to the Green Burial Fund through the Rockland Community Foundation. Donations are tax deductible, and the website is rocklandgives.org. Or if you know someone with 40 acres or so that would like the land preserved, tell them to give me a call. Or they can also email me. I can be contacted through dyingtobloom@gmail.com. Today's guest will be Marilyn Rush, and she is from After Death Home Care, and our topic today is home funerals. A home funeral kind of goes along with the concept of a green cemetery. I've talked on the show before about my visitation to Green Springs, which is a cemetery in Newfield, New York. And there are green cemeteries popping up all over the United States. It's more popular in Europe, but it's a growing trend here in Rockland County. This weekend, I had the opportunity to go on a local cemetery tour on Saturday with the Historical Society of Rockland County. And one of the things I noticed is that many of the cemeteries initially started as family plots. Before the Civil War, when someone died, the family cared for them all at home. They had visitation in the parlor room, and they buried them in the family plot, often on the property. It was after the Civil War in which the funeral industry was born. And we covered this in the first show that I had here on Dying to Bloom with author Mark Harris. He wrote the book Grave Matters. But it was during that era when there was a need to preserve the dead for the long journey home from the battlefield. So that was the birth of our current funeral industry and practices. So it was a wonderful tour with the Historical Society. And again, I found that interesting that I think Brick Church Cemetery was one of them, as well as the cemetery in Sloatsburg, that all had family names associated with them. And that's when they were originally established, just for the family use. I have a book with me. The book is called Final Rites: Reclaiming the American Way of Death. And one of the co-authors was Josh Slocum from the Funeral Consumers Alliance. And this book is a great resource. And in the book, it mentions, and we do have Marilyn on the phone, so we'll go with her in a moment. But in the book, it does mention about burial, since I was just talking about cemeteries and family plots. And as far as New York regulation, it says any person may dedicate land to be used as a family cemetery, provided that it is less than 3 acres and not closer to 1,650 feet to a dwelling. Such land must be registered with the county clerk. We do have our guest on the line. She is on the Board of Directors of the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is a nationwide network of those advocating for personal choice and caring for our own dead. And she is also a retired nurse and home birth midwife. Marilyn Rush, also from After Death Home Care. Good morning and welcome to Dying to Bloom.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for calling in. Now, you're located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, correct?
Correct. And I also want to make another correction. I'm sorry I misinformed you. I am no longer on the board of directors of the National Home Funeral Alliance. I was for 2 years, and that term ended last fall. And then this year I was invited to join the board of directors of the Green Burial Council International. So I'm still very heavily involved in the national movement about home funeral and green burial.
That is wonderful. Can you tell us a moment about the Green Burial Council?
Well, the Green Burial Council has been around for a number of years, and they are the certifying body for green cemeteries and funeral directors all over the country. And now there's a new, that's a 501c6 organization, which is a membership organization for professionals. And now there's a new 501c3 organization called the Green Burial Council International that works very closely with them. That's about educating the public. So that's what I am. I am a community organizer and educator, and I go out and I talk about death with people.
I think that's great.
I'm glad. Or you wouldn't be doing this show, right?
It is an unusual topic, but it is important information. And since you mentioned that you are an educator, you are also going to be having a conference out there in Michigan?
Yes, the Michigan Green Burial Conference takes place on October 11th. And you can learn more about that on my website, which is, as you mentioned, afterdeathhomecare.com.
That sounds great. I commend you for doing that. And as far as the Green Burial Council, I've visited Green Springs before, and I told you about my goal in helping to establish a green cemetery here in the Rockland County area. And as that comes into a reality, I would want the Green Burial Council to endorse or certify the cemetery. Is that correct? They do that as well?
Right. Yep. And they'll give you guidelines, how to go about it, and they'll consult with you and help you get going as you get closer to reaching your goal. Of course, that's voluntary. There's cemeteries in the U.S. that are doing natural burials, green burials that aren't certified, but it's really helpful to have that standard and that sort of overarching, body that's looking at what we're doing here. Since we're so at the beginning of this whole movement, which is, it's really a funny thing to say because, of course, this is how things were done forever before we sort of came into the 20th century way of doing funerals, and now we're kind of getting back to the natural movement.
Yes, I was talking about that right before you called in, and that I was able to visit some historic cemeteries in our area, and I loved that connection of that many of the cemeteries started as family burial plots, and at that time when they were established, that's what people did. They cared for their own family members at home.
Right. Yeah, so when someone died, which was often at home, the family washed and dressed the body with the help of a neighbor or the local midwife or whatever, and they laid him out in the front parlor, and they had a visitation in their home, and within a day or so, whenever they could, they walked to the local cemetery or the family burial plot and buried the body naturally in the ground, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and then they had a period of mourning, but it was all done by the family. There's a growing movement for people wanting to get back to that, realizing that the sort of the big funeral, the way people do it these days, or maybe the way our parents or grandparents did it, just doesn't feel right, or doesn't fit with their beliefs, or doesn't seem, good for the environment. So they're wanting to know how to do this more naturally again. It's like retraining people in this art. We all used to know how to do it, but we've forgotten it.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this line of a service that you provide?
Well, I was a home birth midwife for many years. In fact, I practiced for 3 years in Rochester, New York, and in other states, Mississippi and Oklahoma. And now I'm back in Michigan, my home state. And for many years, I helped families bring birth home, sort of reclaiming the lost art of being able to give birth at home naturally. And that ended 7 years ago, and I kind of fell into this new field, realizing that people also wanted knowledge how to bring death care back home and after-death care back home. So when I heard about that possibility of having a home funeral, it really it struck a chord with me, because it was kind of like I was learning about what had been missing in my life with the death care that I had observed in my family, which just, like I said earlier, didn't seem right to, have strangers take the body away and fill the body with chemicals and make them look kind of fake and weird and mysterious. You didn't really know what happened, and then, you couldn't even really, when you go to a burial, you couldn't even really see the hole for all the astroturf and the equipment and the vault and everything. And when I found out that you could just do this simply by caring for the body at home, washing and dressing the body yourself, laying the person out, cooling the body, usually with dry ice for preservation, and then having a natural burial, I immediately knew that's what I wanted for myself and for my family, and so I set out, to learn more about it. One of the first people I talked to was Lynn Barnes in Rochester, who was involved with the home funeral movement, and she encouraged me to, keep going and keep learning and keep reaching out so that I could help other people.
Now, most states have nearly eliminated any requirements that professionals play a role in funerals. It's now legal in all but 8 states to care for one's own after death. And the growth of a community-based nonprofit home funeral groups like yours and burial grounds that are friendly to the cause points to an increasing demand. So it just so happens that New York and Michigan are 2 of those states that still require involvement of a funeral director. Can you educate us on that?
Sure. So it was never illegal to have a home funeral in any state, but what happened was certain states felt that it was necessary to sort of safeguard the public by ensuring that a funeral director was involved. And Michigan and New York are 2 of those restrictive states, as you mentioned. So what that means is, in addition to having the doctor sign the death certificate, you have to have a funeral director sign the death certificate.
So
it's quite simple to do if you can find a funeral director that will just sign a death certificate. But usually what that means is the funeral director means that they want to be involved. They feel legally responsible for what happens to the body, so they don't just sign the death certificate. They want to have possession of the body.
So it's always been legal. It's just that in New York State, you do need a funeral director involved to sign the death certificate.
The states where it's more restricted, there's 9 of them. That's pretty relatively new. It's not like the restriction was removed in the other states. To the best of my knowledge, it never was there.
That's interesting. And I think it's good for people to know that there are funeral directors that are more willing and helpful in providing this type of service, or helping you to be able to have a funeral service at home and to be more involved. And then, of course, there are the funeral directors that aren't as comfortable with it, whether it is that they do not want to lose the business opportunity or that they just feel uncomfortable with it. But you did mention Lynn Barnett from Westchester. She's not a funeral director, but she is educated in being able to help provide these services here in New York. Right. And Amy Cunningham is a licensed funeral director in Brooklyn who works with Greenwood Heights Funeral and Cremation Services, and she is someone who also is willing to work with you to help be able to provide this service at home for your loved ones.
So there's nothing illegal about it. It's just that the family has to know what they want and be prepared to go and ask for it and find somebody who will be open to working with them.
And I'm sure, someone who would want to do this obviously has a desire to care for their loved one. My own mother and father passed away about 19 years ago, and with my mother, we were involved with hospice and home care, and she did die in the home, and me and my sisters were around her. And 19 years ago, I was not familiar at all with green burials and these types of options. And after she passed away, we all went downstairs and called the funeral home, who came and took her away, and then we didn't see her again for a couple of days as we planned the service, and she was embalmed. So, I don't know if at the time me and my sisters would want to do that care. It is a way. I know there are people out there promoting this, or at least advocating for it as a more natural way to say goodbye to someone you love. And I can certainly also see it more in a partner in life, or regretfully a child as well, to want to do that type of care yourself.
Well, I think you just brought up a really important point, is there's no one right way to do it. I think what I try to let people know is that there's many options, and that you should spend some time thinking about and choosing what is important to you, but not feel like you have to do all or nothing. So for a lot of families who've had a death of a loved one at home in hospice care, being with the body for 4 or 5 or 6 hours might be enough, and then having the body taken away by the funeral home. They don't want to do all the care themselves. That's fine with them. They got what they needed. They spent some time. That's fine. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call that a home funeral, but I would call that, the family doing what they needed to do to take their time to say goodbye to the body. For people who feel like they want a little more time, however, I just want them to know that that's possible. And when you get into having the body at home for longer than a few hours, you do need to think about, caring for the body properly, and you need to cool the body, which slows down decomposition. So that's where I would come in and educating somebody about how to do that.
Can you just expand and help us understand a little more about, since you mentioned that you perform that service, do you find yourself consulting with families way ahead of time, or in the time of need, or a little bit of both? And is there any stories that you feel comfortable sharing?
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit of both, but ideally I'm working with families to educate them way ahead of time, and then they do it all themselves. There's no need to call me. I'm not a funeral director, and I don't do the care. I educate them how to do the care. But for those families that feel like they want somebody to call in the moment to just be there and oversee everything and guide them, and so that they don't have to be bringing out their notes and trying to remember everything, I can be there for that, like as on an on-call basis like that. So typically the families that I've worked with, and I've worked with about 20 now, have called me ahead of time before the death has occurred, but when it seems imminent. And we've sat down and we've just talked about everything they envisioned, whether it was going to be a green burial or a cremation, or whether they were going to have the body be at their home, or if they were going to have a church service, or if they were going to, wait for family members to fly in from elsewhere in the country, or who was going to do the actual care, who was going to purchase the dry ice, all those kinds of things. And then at the time of the death, about half of them end up calling me and saying, my father passed away. Could you come over and just be with us as we do this and help us to remember what to do? And I'll share with you one story of a family that had a daughter that was 5 years old that was very sick. She'd been sick most of her life, and they knew that she was going to pass away, and they called me. And we arranged to have a meeting, and then by the time the day arrived for the meeting, they called me and told me that she had just passed away, so I had never met them. I went to their home and sat with them first, the two parents, in the bedroom where their daughter had died at home in hospice care, and we just took a deep breath, and they told me about her last days, they told me about her life, and we just mourned a bit, and everything was very low-key and just spontaneous and unfolding. And then after a little while, the family members, the other extended family members, were in the living room, and they were kind of wanting to know what we were going to do. So we went out there, and we sat down, and we talked with everybody, and we just said, here's what you can do, and here's some of the steps that we need to take. And so we just kind of moved into, somebody went to purchase dry ice, and the parents came in the room, and we began to wash her body and pick out the clothes that, they wanted to lay her out in, and somebody else was gathering photos and mementos and calling other family members, and they ended up dressing her and doing her hair and doing her nails and decorating the room, and then it was kind of the middle of the night, and everybody went to bed. And then the next morning, they checked on her, and they started having visitors come to the house. And what was a beautiful thing about this was no one knew before this happened what they were going to be comfortable with. In fact, the father said, I don't know if I'm going to be comfortable with having her body at home. I've never heard of this before, never done this before. And the mom was really adamant that that's what she wanted, but she was very sympathetic about her husband's wishes. And, it turns out as they proceeded through it, he was fine. So I think those kinds of fears are really normal because, like I said, this is what we used to do all the time, but we've gotten away from it. And now the only exposure we have to death really is a funeral that's very distant where everything is done for you, or some portrayal of something in a movie or a TV show, which is really a, dramatic Hollywood version. We don't have, normal, like, this is what families can do, I mean, it's been portrayed in a very few, shows, but by and large, people have a lot of horror stories associated with this, so he was a little freaked out, naturally so. I totally get that. But as he was doing it, he was like, oh, this feels right. This is my daughter. I've cared for her all my life. Why should I suddenly be afraid of her body now? It's, none of his fears played out, of course, because that's, they don't. That's not what happens, And when you cool the body, everything's fine. So, they ended up having her body home for like 2.5 days, and they had a 3-year-old daughter who took relatives by the hand when they came to the front door and said, hey, you want to come see my sister? And she grabbed them by the hand and took them back into the bedroom. Now, how can you be afraid when a 3-year-old is guiding you with, love and enthusiasm and complete comfort?
I can understand this is maybe difficult for people to hear. It's not what we're culturally used to at the moment, but again, as you referenced, it is going back to tradition because that is what we used to do. And I just want to share personally for a moment when I was there with my own mother who passed away. I'm not sure if we would have been able to handle her care at home or not, but I do know that as difficult as it was to watch her pass with all of us in the room, I think it was a miraculous experience. I felt blessed that I've had children and I've seen life come into the world, and there was something miraculous and beautiful about seeing life go out, and I do believe she lives on. If anyone does have a question for Marilyn Rush, she is from After Death Home Care, and the number here is 845-362-0013. And to change the topic slightly, funeral cost does play a role potentially in the decision making as well. A full service funeral here in the U.S. runs around $8,000, not including the burial plot, any crematory fees or other goods and services. So have you found that, do you think that cost plays a role in this type of decision as well?
I think it does, but I think it's not the primary motivator because, as you mentioned, this is a heavy responsibility and a heavy emotional load, and if cost is your only motivator, it's not going to work out most likely.
Right. And we do have a caller on the line. Hi, good morning. You're on Dying to Bloom.
Yes, I have a question. I'm very seriously thinking about not embalming someone. And I spoke to the funeral director. He said that was fine, and the person would be buried in a VA cemetery. Mm-hmm. But now I would like, what is the casket called for green burial? I mean, is there a special casket that I could get?
I don't know if you want to answer that or myself. I know that you can just get a regular pine casket, but there's a whole market of biodegradable type caskets. I don't know if the cemetery also has certain requirements as far as that goes.
I would have to check with them first.
Marilyn, what do you think? Mm-hmm.
I would say check with the cemetery and see what the requirements are. Usually they require some kind of, if it's a conventional burial, they require a rigid container, so you're not able to use a shroud or a wicker basket. You'd have to have something with a hard bottom to it. But other than that, all funeral directors, at least in Michigan, are required to accept whatever casket that meets the requirements. That they can't require you to buy one from them. So looking online and all that for something that is to your liking, I would highly recommend that. There's always a markup when you buy it through a funeral director.
If they would go along with that, I don't know.
Well,
that's why I was wondering what it was called. Is it called biodegradable? And then ask the funeral director if they have such a thing?
You can purchase a pine casket that is a biodegradable, and it is a hard, but what you should do is consult with the cemetery, and the cemetery will tell you what the requirements are. As Marilyn mentioned, the funeral director does not have to tell you, you do not have to buy a casket from the funeral home. Mm-hmm. Even Costco sells caskets now. The important thing is just to follow the regulation of the cemetery requirements, especially since you're having a veteran cemetery.
Yes.
So I would check with them and see what they require, and then you can shop on your own for what you'd like to purchase.
Oh, all right. And then you can have that delivered to the funeral home? Would they expect
Yes,
that?
You can purchase through the funeral home, which can be more expensive.
Yes.
But the funeral home by law is required to accept any coffin that you purchase or that you want to utilize.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very interesting. Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Very, very interesting program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
I think we do have another caller. Hi, you're on Dying to Bloom.
Good morning, Kerry, and good morning, Marilyn. I just had a question regarding pre-need funerals in green burial. Are they very more acceptable now, or how is that? Are all funeral homes doing pre-need green burial?
No, not all funeral homes are. Many of them are doing what they call green burial, but it's up to you to check and see how they define green burial. So some will call it a green burial when it's just a plain pine box, and it doesn't have all the other features of what we think of as a green burial. So you have to check on that. You have to know what you want and ask for it and check around.
Are there funeral homes that participate with organizations that do green burials that people could get in contact with?
Yeah, the Green Burial Council website, greenburialcouncil.org, has a list of green burial certified funeral homes and cemeteries.
Right, and would that be all across the country or just in certain areas? Or
across the country.
It would be. Okay. All right, thanks a lot, Marilyn. Kerry, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Another great resource for both callers is the National Funeral Consumers Alliance. And Josh Slocum, the executive director, was a guest on this show before, but their website is funerals.org, and that's exactly what they do. They're a consumer advocate for the death and funeral industry. So if you have any questions regarding the legalities of it, you can visit their website or give them a call. I'm sure they have an 800 number, and they're a great resource. And they also have a wonderful book called Caring for the Dead, which is, I have in front of me. It goes by state. It lists all the legal, the legislation, I should say, for each state in regard to this topic.
I have in front of me the book by Josh Slocum and Lisa Carlson entitled Final Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
Reclaiming
That's
the American
newer
way of
one,
death.
right?
Yeah, the newer one. Yep,
I have the older one by Lisa Carlson. Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being my guest. Is there any final words you can offer? And also, most important, if you can let us know how people can reach you, visit your website, find out about your conference. And again, this is Marilyn Rush from After Death Home Care.
Lots of information on my website, www.afterdeathhomecare.com. And I would say you summarized it very nicely, that it's imperative that because we're at the beginning of this new way of doing things, which is really the old way of doing things, it's up to us to educate ourselves, and there's lots of resources available for you out there. Educate yourself, think about it, get what you want by having the time ahead of time to search for different options. Frequently, when someone doesn't plan ahead, they end up doing what their family has always done, whether or not it's really what they want, because that's what's available in the stress of the moment.
Marilyn Rush, thank you so much for joining us on Dying to Bloom.
Thank you for having me, Carrie. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you. Take care. And again, I just want to mention the two names that I know of people who provide this type of service here in New York. One is Amy Cunningham. She's a licensed funeral director in Brooklyn, and she has a blog called theinspiredfuneral.com. You can also contact me at dyingtobloom@gmail.com if you want more information on her, or Lynn Barnett, who is in Rochester, who also provides this type of service for those that are interested. Well, thank you again for joining me on Dying to Bloom. This show is also available on YouTube, thanks to Jeff Lewis from Group M, who has archived the show for me and provided a great way to catch up if you missed the show or share it with someone else. You can just go to YouTube and search for Dying to Bloom, and you'll be able to hear some of the previous programs. Please consider contributing to the Green Cemetery Fund with the Rockland Community Foundation. Visit rocklandgives.org and look for that fund. As Rosh Hashanah is being celebrated, it's also a time of new beginnings. Pursue a life with no regrets. Pursue your dreams and choose to be happy. I'm Carrie Potter. Thanks for listening to Dying to Bloom.